Working less has nothing to do with time management. That's the reason every attempt at this eventually fails. Not the discipline, not the calendar, not the system you built, and then quietly abandoned 3 weeks later. The load rebuilds because the problem was never the hours. And if you've tried this before and come back to the same desk, the same pace, the same weight, that's not a failure of willpower. That's what happens when you treat a structural problem like a scheduling problem. This video is about what's actually underneath the loop, why the reduction doesn't hold, and what subtraction looks like when it's aimed at the right thing. So let's start by naming the pattern that almost nobody talks about directly. You decide to do less. Maybe you block off Friday afternoons. Maybe you stop checking email after 7. Maybe you read something that finally convinced you that sustainable pace is not a luxury. It's a requirement. And for a while, it works. Then, something happens. A deadline. A request. A moment where the reduced version of you feels like it might not be enough. And you add something back. And then something else. And within 2 or 3 weeks, you are back to exactly where you started. Sometimes further in, actually. As if the brief reduction created a debt you're now repaying with interest. This is the rebuilding loop, and the reason it keeps happening has nothing to do with how serious you were about changing. It has to do with what the load is actually doing for you, which is a different question entirely, and one that almost no productivity content ever asks. Research on high-achieving professionals consistently shows that workload isn't just a function of external demand, it's also a function of internal threshold management. The unconscious floor below which the anxiety of having less outweighs the relief of doing less. In plain language, when high performers reduce their load, something beneath the surface often reads that reduction as a threat. Not a rest, a threat. And the system responds the way it always has, by filling the space back in. That's not a discipline problem, that's a nervous system that has learned that the load is what keeps you safe. And until you understand what it's keeping you safe from, the subtraction will not hold, which brings us to something most people don't examine closely enough. The fear of falling behind is real. The mortgage is real. The team is real. The obligations that don't pause for identity reconstruction. Those are real. This video is not going to tell you those things aren't real, but there's something underneath the fear of falling behind that is worth looking at directly. Because once you see it, the loop starts to make a different kind of sense. Ask yourself this: when you imagine working less, genuinely less, not strategic rest so I can perform better less, what's the first thing that surfaces? For most people in this situation, it isn't logistical. It's something quieter, something closer to, what if I slow down and it turns out the output was the only impressive thing about me? That thought, and most people in this situation have had some version of it, usually late at night, usually not spoken out loud. That thought is not irrational. It's the logical conclusion of a belief that has been operating underneath the schedule for years. The belief that worth is earned through output. That presence in a room is justified by what you contribute to it. That rest is something you get to have after, and the after keeps moving. Here's why this matters for the rebuilding loop. If the load is carrying your sense of worth, if it is functionally the answer to the question, why do I deserve to be here? Then reducing it doesn't feel like relief. It feels like exposure. And exposure triggers the same response every time. Rebuild the evidence. Add something back. Get back to a level of output that feels like enough to justify the space you're taking up. This is what the load is actually protecting. Not your career. Not your team. Not the mortgage. Though the mind will always reach for those first because they're real and they're safer to say out loud. The load is protecting you from having to find out who you are when the output isn't there to answer for you. And that's why every attempt at working less that doesn't address this specific thing eventually rebuilds. You are subtracting from the calendar. The calendar was never the source of the load. So here's where it gets practical. What does subtraction look like when it's aimed at the right thing? It doesn't start with the calendar. It starts with a question. What in the current load actually belongs to the work? And what is there because removing it would make you anxious? Those are two very different categories, and most people have never separated them, because separating them requires looking directly at what the anxiety is about. The first category, work that belongs to the work, is actually smaller than it looks. It's the output that matters, that has real consequence, that you would still do if no one was watching you do it. The deliverable, the decision, the presence that is genuinely required. The second category is everything else. The email sent at 10 p.m. to signal availability. The meeting attended because leaving would feel like absence. The task completed not because it moved anything forward, but because completing it made the anxiety drop for 40 minutes. That second category is not work. It's anxiety management wearing work's clothing. And here is what is true about that second category. It is not keeping you ahead. It is keeping you in the loop. The subtraction framework is not a time audit, it's a load inventory. And the inventory asks one question about everything in the schedule. Is this here because it needs to be here, or because removing it would feel like falling? The things that are there because removing them would feel like falling, those are the things the subtraction is for, not because they're unimportant. Because they were never actually about the work, they were about the fear underneath it. And you cannot fall behind by removing fear. You can only fall behind by confusing fear management with output. This is what's different this time. Not a new system for doing more with less. Not a smarter calendar. Not better boundaries drawn in the same architecture. The subtraction is aimed at the thing the load is actually protecting, which means for the first time, the reduction has somewhere real to go. If this is the layer you've been looking for, the one underneath the time management conversation, there's a resource in the description called the Subtraction System. It's a 21-day structure built specifically for this process, not another thing to add to the schedule. A guided protocol for identifying and removing what doesn't actually belong to you. Not a productivity system, the opposite of one. The link is in the description and the pinned comment. Now let's talk about what actually happens when you start this process. Here's what to expect in the first 2 weeks. The anxiety will spike. This is not a sign that it's not working. This is the sign that you found the right thing to subtract. Because the load that was purely about anxiety management will make itself known immediately when you try to remove it. The discomfort of the empty space is real. It is going to feel, for a short time, like falling behind. That feeling is the nervous system doing what it was trained to do, reading the reduced load as a threat, sending the signal to rebuild. The difference this time is that you know what the signal means. It doesn't mean you're actually behind. It means you removed something that the fear was using. And the fear noticed. Now, the real constraints. The mortgage doesn't pause. The team doesn't pause. The obligations that are structurally real are not subtracted from. This isn't a framework for removing what's actually required. It's a framework for finally seeing the difference between what's required and what's accumulated, because most of the load in a high performer's life was never required. It was absorbed. One anxious yes at a time. One 10 p.m. email at a time. One meeting that could have been an email at a time. And the capacity that gets reclaimed through subtraction, the hours, the attention, the bandwidth that opens up, that doesn't create falling behind. It creates the first real margin many people in this situation have had in years. Margin for the work that actually matters. Margin for the people who have been waiting for the version of you that isn't operating at maximum load. Margin to find out, slowly, who you are when the output isn't carrying the entire weight of your self-concept. Working less, done this way, doesn't risk the career. It risks the performance of the career, the visible busyness, the signal of availability, the evidence of effort that was never really about the work, and that is a very different thing to risk. The loop rebuilds when you subtract from the calendar. It doesn't rebuild when you subtract from the fear. Because the fear, unlike the work, was never load you were supposed to be carrying in the first place. If this opens something, the link in the description goes directly to the subtraction system. 21 days. A structured process for the removal. Not another thing to do. Something, finally. To set down, what's one thing in your current load that you already know is there, because removing it would feel like falling, not because it actually needs to be there. So here's where this lands. The reason it didn't hold before wasn't that you weren't serious. It wasn't that you lack the discipline, or that your life is simply too demanding for this to apply to you. It's that every previous attempt was aimed at the symptom, the hours, the calendar, the visible weight of the schedule. And the schedule is not where the load lives. The load lives in the belief underneath the schedule, the one that says your presence is justified by your output, that rest is something you earn, that slowing down will reveal something that the pace has been quietly preventing anyone from seeing. That belief is not a personal failing. It was built carefully over years by a system that benefited from you believing it. The productivity culture that told you busy was valuable. The professional environments that rewarded availability. The internal architecture that learned, early, that output was the safest answer to the question of worth. A rational response to an irrational system. Not evidence that you are broken. Evidence that you were paying attention to what the system told you mattered. The exit from this isn't a morning routine. It isn't a 4-day workweek policy. It isn't a boundary drawn on top of the same foundation. It's the slower, more specific work of learning to see the difference between the work that is yours and the fear that has been dressed up as work. And when you can see that difference, when you can point to something in the schedule and know, not guess, but know, this is not actually mine to carry, something changes. Not overnight, but it changes. The load was never about the work. It was about what the work was standing in for. And the moment you know that, really know it, not just intellectually but in the body, the subtraction has somewhere real to go. You already know more about this now than you did when you clicked. That's not nothing. That's actually where it starts.